I finally got my own apartment in 2012, and today I was told I had to leave.
It seems every shelter you go to, yeah, I call it like a Band-Aid. And it just patches you, and then you're on your way. That's it.
Homelessness is homelessness. You know what I mean? I don't care if it's here, Philly, California, wherever. Homelessness is homelessness.
When I talk with my friends in Europe, they always express the amazement at the continued existence of shanty towns around California. America's West Coast is, after all, a shining beacon, a place that, in the world's imagination, people go to as to reinvent themselves, and a place that, even in the face of nationalism and hatred, stood up and proudly articulated an alternative version of what America could be. And to be honest, I often find myself just as confused as my friends. I mean, why is it that I can walk around Paris at all hours of the day or night and maybe just see a handful of homeless people? Whereas when I walk around Portland, Oregon, within a few minutes, I've seen dozens of desperately poor men and women living in tents and cardboard shacks a stone's throw from some of the most valuable real estate on the planet. Why is it that in London, this metropolis of 8 million people has far fewer on the streets homeless individuals than Sacramento, a capital city with 1/16 the population? Why is it that Denmark can provide so many options to those who lack permanent residences, but California stumbles from one slapdash expensive and generally ineffective response to the next? Why? Well, let's take a look. For the past 5 years, I've been traveling around Europe, visiting many different countries like Italy, Croatia, the Netherlands, France, Latvia, Czechia, and of course, exploring different cities here in Germany where I currently live. All countries with different levels of wealth and inequality, and different political ideologies animating their governments. Yet the lack of homelessness, or at least the visibility of homelessness, is something that is in stark contrast to where I come from. As someone from the United States, where homelessness and endemic on-the-street drug use and mental illness are the backdrop to everyday life in the state's large cities, it's still an eye-opener to see how the rest of the world fares on this, and it's a continual culture shock every time I travel back to the United States. The major cities in the US, of course, do have a much larger homeless population than rural areas, but even in the Midwest, it is not uncommon to see men and women standing on the exit ramps of the interstate highway systems, holding up cardboard signs, begging people for money. But interestingly, the US doesn't have any more homeless persons than Europe. In fact, the US has less than many European nations per capita, even when breaking down the numbers by comparing the data on a state level. So what's going on behind all of those numbers? More than 500,000 people experienced homelessness in America last year. The Department of Housing and Urban Development counted around 582,000 Americans experiencing homelessness in 2022. That's about 18 people per 10,000 in the US, but in some states, rates skew as high as 44 per 10,000 people. California, Vermont, and Oregon have the highest rates of homelessness across the 50 states. Washington, D.C., however, had the highest rate overall at 65.6 people per 10,000. Mississippi had the lowest at 4.1 per 10,000 people. But in terms of sheer numbers, California has the most people experiencing homelessness, 171,521. New York had the nation's second most, just a little over 74,000, followed by Florida, just shy of 26,000. But homelessness is not restricted to urban areas. For example, Vermont is the most rural state with 65% of its population residing in rural areas, but it still had one of the highest rates of homelessness in 2022. And while I will certainly get into the causal relationships between homelessness in the individual states, please keep in mind that homelessness isn't necessarily the same in every state. For example, in Vermont, 98% of homeless people were sheltered, whereas 67% of homeless Californians were unsheltered. And keep in mind, these figures are not 100% reliable. Rural states, particularly rural states with a lot of unsheltered homeless populations, often have pretty obvious reasons why it's difficult to get a real figure on what homelessness is being experienced in their state. But the truth of the matter is, while you might not see as many homeless individuals in Europe, Europe still is facing a homeless problem. It just might not be as public. Almost 1 million people are homeless on any given night across Europe, according to a report published this year, which by their own admission is likely an undercount. And this 2023 report estimates that Europe-wide, there's been an increase of 30% compared to the last time they did this estimate in 2018. But I do want to go back to those two charts that I showed at the beginning of this section, because I cannot underscore how incredibly difficult it is to do any sort of real international comparison when it comes to homelessness by the numbers. Just take a look at these asterisks and footnotes. One major difficulty in assessing, understanding, addressing, or researching homelessness, especially when you want to have a conversation across nations, lies in the complexity of the situations that may lead people to become socially marginalized, and that makes the problems of defining and the terminology around it pretty thorny. Whether roofless, ill-housed, unhoused, homeless, rough sleepers, unsheltered, living on the street, living in shelters, or living in unsanitary or overcrowded transient accommodations, the people who are affected by homelessness, whether short-term, long-term, or intermittent, often fall victim to stereotypes and exclusion from basic services. And keep in mind, being labeled homeless is often a self-fulfilling prophecy. When people are caught in a vicious cycle of poverty, joblessness, and homelessness, and come to face tremendous hurdles in finding safe and permanent housing. Now, among the European states, there has been one notable exception to this rising trend in homelessness, and that's Finland. And I know, I can already anticipate my right-leaning viewers already saying like, oh great, here we go, another socialist nation with a giant welfare nanny state. Of course they've solved their homelessness problem. Here's what's interesting. While you may want to think that countries like Finland must just be throwing gobs of tax dollars at homeless populations, the reality is the Finns aren't spending any more money. They're just spending the money a heck of a lot smarter. Instead of abandoning the homeless, they housed them. Starting in 2008, they committed to a systematic change in the homelessness policy and homelessness services that they provide. They started not by building new homeless shelters, but instead fully replacing existing shelters and hostels with permanent housing solutions. It's your own rental apartment with your own rental contract, and there's support staff there. In short, their idea centers around the idea that if you want to end homelessness, start by providing them homes. And you might be wondering, okay, but how exactly are they paying for all of this? The money for this endeavor has come from the state government, but a lot of the investment in building new housing was based on low-interest loans, as opposed to grants. The thing that the Finnish authorities have understood, which is proven in international research, is that providing housing for homeless persons is always more cost-effective for society than keeping people homeless. And that's not even taking into account the human cost of homelessness. The government conducted a study which showed that when a formerly homeless person gets housing, even with support, even with prep around that support, the cost savings for society are at least 15,000 euros per person. And in the long run, the cost savings can actually be even greater if they manage to help rehabilitate that person and help them to re-enter the workforce. So more than a decade after the launch of the Housing First policy, 80% of Finland's homeless are doing well, still living in the housing they've been provided with, but now also paying the rent completely on their own. The goal ultimately for Finland is to eradicate homelessness by 2027, just 3 years from now. And they're actually on track to hit it. Currently, they have only around 3,000 homeless persons in Finland, 2/3 of which are people living in temporary housing with friends and relatives. Which for sure, don't get me wrong, Finland isn't a large country. It only has a population of 5.5 million, but that's a homelessness rate of 0.0005. For reference, the US state with the lowest homeless population is Mississippi, which has a population of about half of Finland at just under 3 million, but has a homeless population of over 4%, which is remarkable. But it also begs the question, why haven't such policies caught on in North America or other parts of Europe? Now, at the beginning of this video, I mentioned that while there might not be as many visible homeless persons in Europe, that doesn't mean that they aren't immune to homelessness altogether. Homelessness just tends to look a little bit different in Europe. And there's a few reasons why this is the case. There are actually some overarching principles in the European Union that make roofs over people's heads a human right. For example, in the Greek capital of Athens, for the past 2 years, the homeless population has been protected by a Homeless Bill of Rights, which defines housing access as a fundamental human right. So despite the fact that Greece is a far poorer country than the United States, and certainly far poorer than California, you don't really see homelessness encampments lining city streets, or huge numbers of desperately ill people wandering untreated through urban neighborhoods. But not all countries have adopted these kind of policies, and every country is different whether they're in the EU or not. Post-Brexit Scotland is not in the European Union, but for those Scots who find themselves unhoused for any reason, they report this to the local government council, which is required by law to find you a shelter. Usually this is in a hostel type room, often run by the Salvation Army, which is reimbursed by the government. You then apply to the council for an apartment, usually found within a year. So long as you show that you are actively looking for work, taxpayers pay your rent indefinitely. But there's also the United Kingdom, which by the way has a lot of the same social and wealth inequalities as the United States. And estimates show that in the UK, there are around 250,000 homeless individuals, which is larger than California. In the UK though, the vast majority of these individuals have access to at least temporary housing. In fact, while London has nearly 150,000 homeless people, the number of on-the-streets homeless in the capital city is counted in the hundreds, rather than the thousands. And keep in mind, the United Kingdom has a conservative government, ones that are filled with individuals that aren't all that different from the Republicans in the United States. Yet they have embraced the idea of expanding affordable housing, albeit in a somewhat haphazard way. But it has done so with grassroots support. More than half of the party's voters support increased investments in social housing, or what the US would be termed either public housing or affordable housing. Something the US, by the way, has historically and systematically disinvested in since the Reagan era. And while there is still a long way to go in many European countries, it is really interesting to me that in light of the success of the Finnish model, more and more governments around Europe are actually waking up to this correlation between affordable housing and reducing homelessness. In France, for example, they just announced this year that they intend to step up the allocation of social housing to households or individuals getting off the streets or out of emergency accommodation. They're building off of a plan that was launched in 2017 by President Macron, which in just the past 5 years has enabled 440,000 homeless people to get access to housing, without having to go through emergency shelters and the long integration pathway, which was previously required. And this is also the strategy that the German government is starting to get on board with as well. According to official reports, just over 450,000 people in Germany are currently homeless. As of January 2023, approximately 372,000 of them lived in municipal or private welfare facilities, around 81%. But that still means a sizable population is either staying with friends or acquaintances or have no accommodation at all. The current Traffic Light Coalition government's plan is somewhat similar to France. By 2026, their goal is to have increased our social housing subsidies to a record 14.5 billion euros in order to generate around 100,000 social housing units per year. And although I should mention, these new housing units aren't specifically targeted at the homeless population here in Germany, but it is really interesting and quite frankly encouraging to see a government finally start to recognize the incredible relationship that exists between affordable housing and homelessness within a community. After all, the housing shortage in Germany isn't unique, yet housing shortages and access to affordable housing is the biggest driver of homelessness. And I know, this sounds like it probably shouldn't be that fundamental of a mind shift, that homelessness is primarily driven by a lack of affordable housing, but that seems to be the biggest hurdle, in my opinion, in the United States.
I'm 75 years old. I had to get out of this trailer, it was making me sick. Now I'm living in my truck. Tonight I'm gonna try to lay across this way because my leg's swelling so bad.
They just kept raising it, and I felt like I was losing control of my life.
Private equity's about the quick buck, everything else be damned.
Republican or Democrat, nobody wants affordable housing in their backyard.
There's no life like being homeless.
One of the more interesting things that I found while researching for this video is that it seems to be that the general public tends to overestimate the role that mental illness specifically plays in homeless populations and the production of homelessness within a community. While a considerable number of individuals experiencing homelessness do have severe mental illness or a substance use disorder, most estimates indicate that under half of the overall population experiencing homelessness is actually affected by these conditions. And when you really take a look at the data, rates of mental illness and substance abuse amongst a population actually don't predict homelessness at the community level. The best predictor of homelessness in a population is access to affordable housing, period. Don't believe me? Let's take a look back again at those statistics. Hawaii, California, Washington, D.C. In the US, these are where you're going to find the nation's highest housing costs and, unsurprisingly, high rates of homelessness. West Virginia and Mississippi have the country's least expensive homes and, wouldn't you guess it, fewer homeless people. And the same correlation between housing and homelessness holds true when you take a look at the demographics of homelessness. Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders have the highest rate of homelessness in the US at 121 per 10,000 people. And this is reflected in the high homeless rates in Hawaii. And this is undoubtedly contributed to by Hawaii's lack of affordable housing. Many Native Hawaiians are also on the wait lists for home land leases. And interestingly, veterans also experience homelessness at a slightly higher rate than the overall population. 20 out of every 10,000 veterans are homeless compared to the nation's overall rate of 18 per 10,000. However, the number of homeless veterans has fallen since 2010. Why? Well, at least for veterans, the United States government started to follow the Finnish model. The US government established programs such as the HUD Veterans Affairs Supported Housing Program that helps veterans find permanent housing and access to universal healthcare programs. And it's working. The rates of homelessness are falling. And while I think that's amazing, it's also incredibly frustrating that this isn't available to the public at large. The truth is, by and large, People are not actively choosing homelessness and resisting high-quality services. It's just that the large majority of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness lack an alternative option that feels safe and stable. Temporary shelters, while good-natured, are often unsafe and overcrowded, and often people exit or avoid shelters out of concerns about personal safety and agency. Furthermore, many programs in the States follow a treatment-first approach to housing, which demand compliance with strict rules and requirements that can be controlling and burdensome, such as mental health treatment, sobriety, and medication adherence. The linear path that these programs are designed to follow, from shelters to transitional facilities and eventual placement in permanent housing, only once the client has complied with treatment and is considered quote-unquote housing ready, often entails bureaucratic barriers and lengthy and indeterminate timeframes at each stage. That can obviously breed frustration and disappointment among people without housing, whose diverse needs are often unmet by such service models. And truth be told, I think that is exactly what makes the Finnish model so successful. By prioritizing someone's basic needs of food and shelter above things like employment or sobriety or income, for example. Yeah, don't get me wrong, those things will come with time and assistance, but you tackle housing and food first. After all, if you're truly going to rehabilitate someone, they need to not be fighting for their basic survival in the first place. Let them feel safe. Let them feel like they can really actually focus on themselves without needing to worry about whether or not they have a roof over their head and somewhere dry and warm to sleep at night. It's a very human-centric approach, if you ask me. But speaking about me, gosh, listen, I completely recognize that I'm not homeless, and I do want to acknowledge the incredible privilege and the pretty strong juxtaposition that I have in even addressing this subject while speaking in the comfort of my living room. But I wanted to talk about this subject specifically because homelessness has become, in many ways, both the measuring stick for societal health and the scapegoat for its shortcomings. In other words, we look towards our most vulnerable as both the product of failed public policy and the cause for such failure, even when that might not necessarily be the case. Homelessness is one of the most extreme forms of social exclusion, negatively affecting people's physical and mental health, their well-being, and their life expectancy, as well as their access to employment and access to other economic and social services. All things that I frequently talk about on this channel. And so unsurprisingly, homelessness comes up quite frequently in the comment section of my videos. And I really wanted to talk about this subject just to underscore that when our community as a whole is healthy and housed, our community as a whole does better. And again, not forgetting that we are a community. But I would love to hear from you down in the comment section of this video about how homelessness is being tackled in your neck of the woods. One of the things that I found so interesting, again, while researching for this subject, was just how different governments' approaches are to tackling homelessness. While the Finnish model has certainly been very successful, it's by no means the only strategy to reduce the homeless populations in different parts of the globe. So I'd love to hear from you on what your personal experiences have been, what you think about your government's strategy to tackle homelessness. Is there more that can be done? And what are some success stories that you can personally share? Again, please let me know down in the comments below. And as always, if you enjoyed what you saw today, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. And for more content from Type Ashton, hit that subscribe button. So I'll see you next Sunday. Tschüss!